Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS semifinals and finals overview and analysis video. Very excited to jump into this too. Obviously, very important series. We know the three teams that are going to be going to Worlds representing North America, or at the very least, the three teams that will be going, because of course, Golden Guardians will get the chance to play their way into the tournament, but the three teams that have confirmed their spots in the Swiss stage will be playing off here today to determine not only the order in which they will be heading to Worlds, but our 2023 Summer Split LCS champions. Obviously a very exciting thing, and three very interesting orgs that are going to be going head-to-head in these matchups. So I'm very excited. I hope you guys are as well. Of course, if you are, let me know down in the comment section below. Who did you think was going to be coming out of these games as the champion? Did you think that the outcome that ended up happening was the one you were anticipating, or did somebody end up overperforming your expectations, or maybe underperforming your expectations? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and feedback on all of these games, of course, down below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. If you are new here, what we're going to be doing in this video is going game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I will be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in each series, and then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything in a nice little bow. Of course, like I said, we will be talking a bit about Worlds because World seeding is entirely based on how these teams perform in these series, and so it is definitely at least a factor. But for the most part, we're going to be keeping it at least a little bit self-contained through these series. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Of course, we're going to be covering the final two series of the year, which means we get to kick it off with our semifinals, or our lower bracket finals series, between the number 5 seeded NRG and the number 4 seeded Team Liquid. These teams have already faced off against each other in a best of 5 in the playoffs, all the way back in winners round number 1, the upper bracket round 1. It was one of the first series that we got in the playoffs, and we're getting a rematch of it here in the semifinals. Both of these teams have been on very interesting trajectories throughout the playoffs up until this point. Energy obviously has looked really good up until this point, or at least pretty good up until this point. Being able to take down Team Liquid in round number 1 was a super impressive win, one that I don't think a lot of people considered a major upset, but certainly one that I was not expecting. And then for them to be able to take down Golden Guardians in round number 2 as well, I do think shocked a lot of people. Golden Guardians obviously a lot of people's pick to be the number 2 team, hell, even compete for that number 1 spot, that champion spot in the playoffs. Obviously, things haven't necessarily worked out for them, but Energy looking really good in those two series. Now, they did get blasted by Cloud9 in the upper bracket finals, but that's okay. They get another shot here to potentially get into that matchup with Cloud9 with Team Liquid, and, you know, TL's certainly not going to roll over. This team has really started to, come back alive, I would say. A lot of the players that really needed to step up absolutely have been stepping up throughout the playoffs. Summit and Pioshik in the top side specifically, because they're really the players that I think this team ends up living and dying by. Summit is so important towards what this team wants to do in terms of his consistency, because he can be a little bit of a nuisance when he's not playing particularly well, and Pioshik has looked fantastic in the series where it has mattered the most, specifically in that series against Golden Guardians for that 4th place seed. Pioshik was phenomenal. He was spectacular, and if those two can step up, I would say Team Liquid should absolutely be favorites in this series. I like APA, I like Yan and Core, I think they're very solid, and honestly, Team Liquid was the team that I was favoring going into this series. I ended up predicting them, although I don't think it's a blowout by any means. Energy is a good team, but I would expect Team Liquid to be better. But Energy definitely has a lot of positives in their direction as well. Their bot lane is playing the best that they have played all year long up until this point, and Dokla Contracts and Palafox can win any game that they need to, so just going to be a fun series nonetheless. But without further ado, let's jump into game number 1, because we're going game by game here. And of course, game 1, very important for momentum and confidence. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 1 was NRG. They are going to be able to take the first game in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and obviously, this is a really nice win. Being able to generate momentum against a team like Team Liquid is going to be incredibly important and incredibly influential towards how the rest of the series ends up going. Team Liquid, out of all of the teams in North America, in my opinion, is the most reliant on momentum and confidence to play at their highest level, because we know how talented they are, but when Summit's not having a good day, when Pioshik's not having a good day, they struggle a lot more. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that this was a huge blowout or anything like that. This was a banger of a game. Team Liquid actually stayed in it for quite a long time. There were a lot of different avenues for them to be able to set up potential team fights. Towards the back half of the game, they did a good job equalizing in objectives and making sure the game didn't get too far out of control. The problem was that energy just scaled up way too hard towards the back half of the game, and two champions, the Rumble and the Kai'Sa in particular, just got a little bit too out of control for Team Liquid to actually be able to team fight against, and that ended up being, their demise. But this was an absolute banger of a game number one between two teams that you were really hoping to see some fun action between. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the game for me is going to go to FBI in the bot lane. He's very quietly been phenomenal for this team throughout their playoff run. I know that Palafox and Contracts are the two that are going to get the most attention, and rightfully so. Contracts in particular, I think, has been this team's best player all year long, and Palafox has obviously been right up there with him, but FBI and Ignar have stepped up so much over the course of this playoff run. Ignar's been fantastic. FBI has been, very stable, a rock down in the bot lane for this team, and I think that that continued to be a big positive here. They get FBI Kai'Sa, which is a very important pick in the current meta. We've seen teams actually start to move away from what Kai'Sa ends up offering. I don't necessarily understand why. It feels like the ease of execution for Kai'Sa is just kind of there, and she can really fit into any comp that you want her to fit into. She's just very versatile in how you want to play her, and I think FBI showed that in this game, ended up being more of that artillery mage, AP style Kai'Sa with the W's, and that was such a major problem for Team Liquid to have to deal with over the back half of this game. Yan would get hit by 1 or 2 W's, and all of a sudden Team Liquid couldn't fight anymore, and it made it very difficult for, champions like Nico or Viego that really rely on getting in close to actually be able to do the things that they wanted to do because FBI was zoning them out so much. The Kai'Sa ended up getting the 3 items, and then all of a sudden it felt like the game was over, so very good stuff from FBI. Obviously, the champion is strong, but you still have to pilot her well. We've seen a lot of Kai'Sas end up losing games because they're just not able to get to the point where they can be strong. FBI, I think, played the early game well and was definitely the most influential member of the team. I want to give a big shout out to Dokla on this Rumble. Wasn't exactly the most dominant of early games in the entire world going into Summit's Aatrox, but by the time we hit the late game, those equalizers were doing so much damage. Rumble ult can really be a major problem for a team that really relies on kind of the wombo combo initiation of Nico, and then ideally like Viego plus Aatrox plus Nautilus all just kind of diving in, right? Rumble really makes it a lot more difficult to play that style, and Dokla was super important towards the back half of the game. Ignar was really good, Contracts was really good, Palafox was fine on the Tristana. It just felt like everything was kind of going in favor of energy, and I do think that they played the back half, especially of this game, very well. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, you had some moments in this game. You really weren't completely outclassed. I think, like I said earlier, you were doing some things right. You were keeping your head in the game. You weren't giving up on a lot of these plays. However, it just didn't feel like you had the X factor to be able to win this game towards the back half. I think you were really relying on Pioshik to be that, on the Viego to be kind of this big reset king like he was in that series against Golden Guardians last week, but it just wasn't the same here. The Viego had a much more difficult time of actually being able to get in on the enemy comp, and if your Viego's not resetting, you're really relying on Xayah to be able to set up and, complete, I would say, a lot of the plays for this team, and Yan was just getting chunked out way too quickly in these fights, and so Liquid ended up not being able to take it. My dud of the game is going to go to Core JJ on the Nautilus. It felt like basically every engage towards the back half of the game on the Nautilus ended up being more negative than positive. He was often going in first for this team, which is not really what you want to do with Nautilus here. You've got the Nico, you've got the Aatrox. You really want to let them be the playmakers, and then you can either be Peel to try to get people off your Viego or off your Xayah or whoever ends up being your carry, or you want to be that secondary follow-up because you do have very good initiation coming in from the rest of this team. Core didn't necessarily get that memo, I don't think. He felt the responsibility to end up engaging in a lot of these circumstances, and I do think it was harmful towards the team overall, but really, I think Liquid had moments in this game where it really did feel like they could win. They just couldn't quite grasp onto it and keep it locked down. Again, I think if you draft this same comp, you're going to struggle a bit, but I think a couple of tweaks here or there, and I think you're in a relatively good spot. It was a lot of comfort for this team, and so I don't expect them to change it up too much, but again, I think Nico into something like Kai'Sa and Rumble is just not exactly the avenue I would necessarily be going here, but gonna be interesting to see if they continue down this path or if they want to switch it up. But Energy taking a strong win here in game number 1, taking control. Are they going to be able to maintain that control, or is Liquid going to be able to tie this series up at 1 apiece? Well, we'll find out right now, because the winner of game number 2 was Team Liquid, they are going to be able to take game number 2. They're going to be able to even up the series at 1 apiece, and obviously, this is incredibly important for them. You don't want to go down 0-2 in any series in the playoffs. Reverse sweeping is incredibly difficult, but especially for a team that relies so much on momentum, to put yourself in such a deficit so early on would be majorly negative for Team Liquid overall. So for them to be able to take this game, again, in very, very interesting fashion, a very similar kind of game state to game number 1, except I think Team Liquid just did a little bit of a better job closing it out, not by a ton, because we'll talk about how they continue to struggle to close out games. I still think that they did a good enough job, clearly, because they won the game, and they did a better job, I think, of controlling the mid game, which I think really helped out a lot for Liquid. So, you know, Energy, I think, is definitely going to be looking at this game. They're going, we drafted this really annoying comp, we drafted LeBlanc Kai'Sa, we got Kai'Sa super online, and she was dealing a lot of damage. FBI absolutely had the ability to potentially carry this game, but it just wasn't enough. There were quite a few missed opportunities, I would say, towards the back half. You've got a Trundle going into very few tanks. You've got Gwen, who's really going to be able to light up the rest of this team. Just not a lot of really good circumstances for Energy as you hit the later part of this game, and I do think that that was kind of a detriment. They still did their best to try and come back in this one, but it just wasn't enough. Team Liquid had enough firepower as opposed to game number 1 to be able to close it out here in game number 2. But let's go ahead and talk about it. My player of the game in game 2 is pretty easily going to go to Yawn in the bot lane on this Draven. Super crucial game from Yawn here. I really do think that there were a lot of opportunities for Liquid to throw this game. APA was diving way too deep on some of those Nico ultimates, which has become very much a theme. APA has very much become a Nico player as these playoffs have gone along, which is a very interesting transition for Liquid. Maybe they just like the opportunity for him to be able to set up this Viego because they do want to play the Viego, but man, I just don't think Nico was very good. I think Nico is fine. I should say that. I think Nico is generally fine, but I certainly don't think she's one of the best mid laners in the game right now. I think, you know, obviously the Ziggs is going to be consistently banned out, and they had the Trist banned out against them here. They themselves banned out the Jace and the Azir, and so the mid lane pool was very much shallowed, but I don't know, I'm just not nearly as high on Nico as I was a couple of months ago because we've just seen so many circumstances where she's just not very useful, and I think it continues to be the case here, that Nico is fine, but doesn't necessarily give you any sort of consistency, especially towards the back half of game. She thrives in these mid-game skirmishes, and you want to get these big 5-man ultimates, but oftentimes you're not really doing a whole ton with them, and I think that that was more of the case in this game. However, there were a couple of good ones. I don't want to say that it was entirely negative for APA in this game. That certainly wouldn't be an accurate telling. I just think that he was a little bit of a problem, especially in the mid game here, but bot lane was more than enough to pick up the slack there. Yawn in particular was incredible this game. His mechanics were absolutely on point. I know people were a little bit concerned with him drafting Draven and trying to play this more aggressive early game style that Team Liquid hasn't necessarily wanted to play towards in the bot lane basically since Spring Split, but Yawn was phenomenal in this game. I mean, truly spectacular. His mechanics were, I mean, as on point as you could possibly be. The stopwatches, the positioning, the damage, all of it was so good on Draven that you just have to give him a lot of credit. I think if Yawn was worse in this game, if he was getting caught out a little bit more often by some of the, you know, really easy engage threats coming out from Energy, I think that this would have been an Energy win, but because Yawn was playing so well, because he was so consistently able to get off a lot of damage towards the back half of these games, I think that is the reason the Team Liquid was able to win. You do have to give a lot of credit to Core JJ for setting him up in a lot of these circumstances. Of course, that's going to be very important for this team as well, but Summit, I think, played well on the Gwen. The Viego hasn't really been a major factor in this series up until this point, but Pioshik did a really good job of controlling objectives and controlling the map. He just wasn't really a teamfight menace quite like he was in previous series, but in general, I still think that this was a good game for Team Liquid. They stumbled down the stretch. They certainly gave some hope over to Energy, you know, in the late game, as Team Liquid is one to do, but they were able to close it out, and they were able to get the win, which at the end of the day is probably the most important thing. But for Energy on the other side, certainly some positives, but, you know, just wasn't good enough. It wasn't quite, you know, convincing enough towards the back half of the game to be able to make the comeback real. FBI continues to be a massive positive for this team. Kai'Sa continues to be a super strong pick. I know a lot of people are really complaining about it. Welcome to the club. I've been doing this for 2 months. When people were complaining about Zeri, I was like, oh, and you want Kai'Sa in the meta to throw out W's and just stand behind and basically have no agency? I was very vocal about that, especially in a lot of my LCK videos where people just complained and complained and complained. They're like, oh, I'm so happy Kai'Sa's back in the meta and Zeri's out. welcome to the club. Kai'Sa at this level kind of sucks. Like, yeah, Kai'Sa can be hype when she's full AD and when she has to dive in, but that is so rarely what Kai'Sa is used for at the pro level anymore that I'm just not really excited to see this champion really ever at pro, and I think that continues to be a thing, but I'm not going to take it away from FBI that he played well on a champion that I consider strong right now. They're giving him this champion, and so if they're going to give it to him, he's going to pilot it well, and I think FBI is playing well. Those W's are hurting quite a bit. Palafox was doing quite a bit on the LeBlanc as well, consistently dashing in and out and dealing a lot of damage, but like I said, Yon did a really good job to make sure that the LeBlanc really wasn't as big of a problem as you would think on paper. Palafox certainly wasn't bad this game, but Yon was better, and I think you could say the same thing for Ignar. Set up FBI quite a bit, set up Palafox quite a bit, but topside was just kind of a problem. Dokla had basically no impact on the Cassante, which is always going to be a pretty big negative over the back half of the game because that champion should generally be very strong, and Contracts wasn't good at all. He's going to get my dead of the game on the Trundle. I don't like Trundle into this team comp at all. I don't like Trundle in general right now. I don't think he's necessarily the strongest jungler. I don't think that there are a lot of like super strong junglers outside of the top tier when you're thinking about the Sejuani, you're thinking about the Maokai, things like that. But they were up on the board, and I think that they would have been significantly more valuable this game than what the Trundle was towards this team, and so I don't think Contracts piloted it particularly well either. I think he obviously lost some pressure in the early game, did a relatively okay job of trying to claw back, but most of the late game was on FBI, was on Palafox, was on Ignar to be able to try to bring the game back. And so, topside definitely being a little bit more of a negative, but you're not going to overreact. The series is tied up at 1 apiece, and both teams absolutely have an opportunity to take control here. Is Energy going to regain that control, or is Team Liquid going to say, Game 1 was a bit of a fluke, it's our series to lose now? Well, we're going to find out now because the winner of game number 3 was NRG. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to regain control of this series, going up 2-1, and this is a nice win for them. Obviously, you want to position yourself a little bit better after that game number 2, but you've already shown a lot of resilience, and so to see them be able to come out in this series and be able to win in the early game using a comp that I think really does play to a lot of their strengths, drafting, I think, a lot better in this game, and we'll get to my Team Liquid, draft analysis in a second. Again, I'm just so low on Nocturne Nico as a combo. I think it is super overrated, but we'll talk about that in a bit. I think Energy did a really good job of trying to corral and contain a lot of the wombo combo potential of what Team Liquid was offering, and I think a lot of their players ended up just stepping up. A lot of outplays in this game coming in from Energy that I think are incredibly impressive, and this is how you take down a Kai'Sa comp. This is how you take down something that theoretically would just be able to scale into Oblivion and be able to kind of beat you. You play aggressive early, and you don't let Yon get to the part of the game where he's actually going to be able to win. Kai'Sa's not nearly as unbeatable as I think a lot of people would make her out to be. She absolutely has her weaknesses, even if she's kind of a boring and strong champ, but I do think that, she's beatable, and that was very clear in this game, and I think Energy definitely capitalized on those weaknesses much better than what Team Liquid had been doing over the course of this series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, player of the game for me was actually kind of difficult in this one because I do think that 2 players in particular very much deserved it. I settled on Palafox getting it in the mid lane on this Tristana. Just felt like a lot of the action that he had in the early game was super influential towards what this team wanted to do. He bodied APA in the laning phase. This is one of the big lane gaps, one of the bigger lane gaps that I've seen in the playoffs, basically in any series up until this point. Palafox was just straight up better in this game, and it was very apparent, very easy to see from pretty early on, and you got to give him a lot of credit for that. Palafox has been really good for this team throughout the entirety of the year. Now, there has been some up and down moments for him. He hasn't exactly been consistent over the course of this entire year, but when he looks good, he looks really, really good, and I think that this was another example of that. Really good Tristana game, another champion that I think is very strong in the meta right now, probably the best mid laner in the game. Palafox looking very good on it. And then for Ignar, he's the other player that I really want to shout out as, having a really, really good game. I debated back and forth giving player of the game to Palafox or giving it to Ignar, but I ended up giving it to Palafox just because I do think that the laning phase kind of pushed me over the edge. But when it came to the team fight in, mid-game stage of this game, the Braum was the most important champion on the side of Energy towards actually ending this game as quickly as possible. FBI obviously played fantastic. A lot of really, really good mechanical plays. Both AD carries, I think, were mechanically playing well in this series, but without Ignar on the Braum, I think this game is a lot more difficult for Energy to actually close out as quickly as they did. Yes, they have damage, but it's not like a ridiculous amount of damage, and I do think that you need ways to be able to peel off a lot of the hard engage that Team Liquid is going to end up throwing at you throughout this game, and I think Ignar did a fantastic job of that. So Palafox, Ignar, great. FBI had a really good game, even if his scoreline doesn't necessarily indicate it. The double heal bot lane ends up coming in clutch here with the Braum, and the Ezreal. Contracts was much better on the Maokai. This is the pick that he probably should have gone to in game number 2, and then Dokla probably had his best game of the series here in Game 3 on the Cassante, so everything just kind of working out. Energy looking a lot better, playing around their win conditions well, and honestly, this was a pretty dominant game. Easily the most dominant of this series up until this point, but the same can be said for Team Liquid in the opposite direction, right? This was the most dominant game of the series in a negative way for Team Liquid. Again, I'm very low on Nocturne. Nico, I think Nocturne in general is very much bait. Like, Nico, I can understand there are going to be opportunities for her to create plays, and at the very least, even if her scoreline isn't good, she's probably going to have 1 or 2 major plays a game, and she still had 1 or 2 major plays in this game, even though she completely got destroyed in lane phase, which I'll talk about in a second. But Nocturne, in my opinion, is like completely bait. This champion just doesn't really do anything. Braum, single-handedly as a champion, kind of completely negates what Nocturne wants to do. You could say the same thing about Maokai. You could say similar things about Cassante. It's just very difficult for Nocturne to actually be able to play in this current meta. I get it's really fun to be able to hit 4-man ultimates and have Nocturne dive on the backline and blow somebody up, but oftentimes with Noc, you're trading 1 for 1, and that's almost never going to be worth it in a comp where you're really relying on that Wombo to be most of your damage. Like, hopefully Kaisa can pick it up, but you didn't get to the part of the game where that was even really possible in this one. So, well, you know, we'll talk about it, but Pyosik was just not very useful in this game, and Nocturne in general, in my opinion, has not been very useful. But just as there were 2 really good players on the side of Energy, I think that there were 2 kind of separately bad players on the side of Team Liquid. I'm going to give dead of the game to APA. I think his, you know, lack of laning phase was the biggest problem Team Liquid had in this game. I know a lot of people are going to point to some of the really good engages he had over the back half, but they were at such a deficit at that point, and in my opinion, a lot of that was on the Nico, losing lanes so hard and giving up so much pressure to the Tristana and Maokai to be able to move around the map and basically get everything they wanted in the mid game was a major problem for Liquid, and that was kind of the reason they ended up losing. And so, yes, APA made some good plays, but I think the negative plays honestly kind of canceled it out for me. I think Core JJ also played pretty poor on the Rel. A lot of really bad engages, just really poorly timed things. It just didn't feel like he was very on this game, and that's certainly concerning. He's been pretty up and down throughout this playoff run in general, often gets scapegoated for this team, but, you know, is similar to APA, those were the 2 that were kind of trying to make plays towards the back half. They were just kind of bad plays, and so I think you end up looking at them in a more negative light. But Yawn, I don't think played particularly well. This is the first game we've seen Kaisa really struggle, and that's because, again, they shut her down before she was able to get to the part of the game where she could actually do anything all that important. And then Summit was, I guess, fine, like really not a lot to talk about when it comes to the Aatrox, but for Liquid, you've got to be able to clean this up. It really does feel like their drafts are holding them back a considerable amount, in my opinion. You played Nico 3 games in a row here, and I think it's been a major detriment to this team, whether you're going to play it with Nocturne or not. Like, I just don't like this idea for Liquid. I want them to go to something that's going to be a little bit more consistent, something that doesn't rely on executing this, like, big wombo in order to really be all that useful. I really just don't like this combo, and I think Liquid is struggling for it. And then Energy's in a good position. They're now 1 game away from going to the finals in their first split back in the LCS, which is major for this team. A lot of these players, I think, absolutely deserve it after the time they've spent, you know, kind of climbing their way back up. But are they going to be able to do it here? Let's not crown them yet because Liquid has a chance to fight back. Are we going to be going to a Silver Scrapes Game 5, or is Energy going to be able to close it out in 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to send us to a game number 5, and I am incredibly excited to talk about it. This was an 18-minute win for Team Liquid. We talked about game 3 kind of being dominant for Energy. Well, here's Team Liquid's dominant game of this series. It's going to be game number 4. Great stuff from Liquid, playing a lot more towards comfort. Again, still going towards a comp that I would consider relatively risky in terms of execution, but if you are able to execute on it, it's incredibly good, and I just don't like Energy's draft nearly as much as I did in the first couple of games in this series, and so I think Liquid ends up getting away with it a little bit more. Just really, really solid stuff. Again, Pyosik going towards a champion that he's very comfortable on. We always know him for things like the Kindred and even the Viego now, but Lee Sin is obviously a major pick for him and has been over the course of his career. Those are the 3 that I think you have to classify as Pyosik's kind of main champion pool, if you will. And Energy just didn't have an answer in the early game. They picked a comp that really kind of wants to scale into the late game. That's really what you get when you get Aurelion Sol in the mid lane, and they weren't able to really get to that part of the game. And so, good stuff from Liquid, playing to their win condition, knowing what they have to do and executing on it. Player of the game is so easy for me to pick. It's easily going to go to Pyosik in the jungle. Awesome game on the Lee Sin here. He really controlled the tempo super early on, and this is the Pyosik I think that Team Liquid really needed in this series in order to be able to put themselves in a more comfortable position. We talked about how important he was towards this team's success, not only in the regular season, but throughout the playoffs, especially in that Golden Guardian series as well. He's just been incredibly important towards what they want to do, how they want to play, where they want to put a lot of their attention. If they're able to win in the early game super hard and able to close it out relatively quickly, which is something that Pyosik does relatively well, then this team is really, really hard to beat because their laning prowess is among the best, if not the best, in the entire league. And so, good stuff from Pyosik. Lee Sin is a champion that I think fits what this team wants to do really well. Even if I don't necessarily think Lee is all that good right now, in fact, I think Lee is in a pretty poor spot right now. I think if you're going to pilot it like this, it's really hard for me to complain about it. And again, it fits into the archetype of what they want to play relatively well. I do think that APA had a much better game here. Again, moved around the map, was a little bit more aggro. This is probably the best Nico game of the series, and I think that that's, debatable. Game 2 was still relatively okay, but this was probably the most consistent of the Nico games. But playing it into Aurelion Sol, you have so many more opportunities to do the things that Nico really likes to do before that A-Sol gets online. You're basically saying, like, we're not a champion for the first, 12 minutes of the game. That's what Aurelion Sol is at the current moment. And so for APA to be able to take advantage of that time of the game, to be able to use Nico to move around the map, I think was a lot better. Yon and Core were solid. Summit had a much better game here on the Jax in game number 4. Just in general, it felt like a lot of things were kind of going in the direction of Liquid that weren't necessarily going their way in the first couple of games, which is really good. But a lot of that, in my opinion, is kind of more on energy than it is on Liquid. As much as I do like what Liquid was able to do this game, specifically Pyosik, who I do think was probably the standout player, I don't really get what energy was doing in game number 4. I don't get their draft, I don't get their execution, I don't really get what they were going for. Nothing really worked for me here. Dud of the game is going to go to Contracts, and yes, I understand that he was the only one who had 100% kill participation on the side of energy, but he also had a ton of negative plays, just continuously, chasing down and overextending it, and this felt like old Contracts. This felt like Golden Guardians Contracts from many years ago, where it's like, you just need to calm down. You need to be there to kind of set up some of these more positive plays. He gave up a lot of pressure in the early game to the Lee Sin, which you kind of have to do if you are the Poppy, but was never really able to recover. He played the mid game very poorly, and overall, I would just say it was a bad game for Contracts. But again, this draft kind of put them in a negative spot. They were going to lose the early game, and I think they wanted to rely on the fact that they've been the better team fighting team by a large margin over the course of this series, but you never really got to that stage. Palafox, I think, played well on the Aurelion, did about as much as he could, but it takes way too long now for that champion to get online. I compare it to Sivir in the bot lane. I think that they are very similar picks right now, where I can understand the ideology of, if you hit that breakpoint, all of a sudden this champion is going to be incredibly difficult to deal with, but good teams won't let you hit that breakpoint, and especially Team Liquid, who's really good in the early game, they're going to be able to take advantage of the weaknesses that Aurelion Sol has inherently as a champion, even if it is probably Palafox's signature pick at this point. The bot lane was absolutely nothing in this game. The Ezreal worked out significantly worse than it did in game number 3. Dokla wasn't very good on the top side. Summit definitely had full control of that lane. Just in general, it felt like the team wasn't nearly on the same level that they were in the other parts of this series, which is frustrating. And going into game 5, they're going to need to turn that around. Obviously, it's win or go home for both of these teams. Both are locked in for Worlds, but both want to get to finals. Don't forget that that's a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself, and especially with how how these teams have gone throughout the year. Energy in their first split back, Team Liquid not even making playoffs in the spring split. Both are really looking to kind of change the narrative, rewrite what they want, and get into that finals matchup to take on Cloud9. But only one is going to be able to do it. Is it going to be Energy, or is it going to be Team Liquid? Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 5 was NRG. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to take the semifinal series, and they're going to be moving on to the finals in the LCS coming up later in this video, obviously, but big win for this team, for this org, to be able to make the finals in their first split back in the LCS in many, many years, for this core of players that has kind of been the CLG roster for many years. Dokla, Contracts, Palafox, to be able to make it back to finals is huge. For FBI to be able to make finals is huge. The dude has done it so consistently over the past few years with 100 Thieves, that being able to do it again here on Energy is a really interesting story. And for Ignar, who basically everybody had counted out, me included, to be able to make finals, and for him to be as good as he was in this series is massive. Of course, Team Liquid not going to be moving on to finals, going to be finishing their split in 3rd place, still going to be going to Worlds, but not quite the ending I think they hoped for when they moved into this series. But let's go ahead and talk about game 5 before we get too big picture here. Really fun game number 5. Energy definitely controlled it. It wasn't quite as dominant as games 3 and 4, where it really didn't feel like there was ever, like, a chance for the enemy team to get back into it, but Energy was the better team by a large margin in this game. They got everything that they wanted to get, and their players were just better. A couple of major misplays coming in from Team Liquid that I think definitely cost them in this game, but overall, you've got to give a lot of credit to a lot of the players on Energy. Player of the game and player of the series for me here is going to go to Ignar in the support position, and this might surprise some people. I think that there are going to be a lot of people that want to give player of the series to Palafox. I think that's what he got on broadcast. I think that there are going to be a lot of people that want to give player of the series to FBI, who I think was also really good. It's between those three for me. They were the three best players on the team, as good as Dokla and Contracts were. Contracts, definitely struggled in their losses, and I think Dokla wasn't nearly as dominant as you maybe would want. I think it really was between those three, but I'm going to settle on Ignar because I really do believe he was the most important player to Energy across this series, and he has been phenomenal in their playoff run. He's not going to get nearly the same kind of press that he deserves, but he's probably been the best support in the LCS in the playoffs, which is crazy. That is certainly not something I expected. He wasn't even close to that accolade in the regular season. It's not like he was performing great, although, like I said in my primer, he got better and better and better as the season went on, and by the time the regular season ended, he was a very consistently good support for this Energy team, often giving them a lot of advantages, but even I couldn't have predicted him to continue that growth a lot in the playoffs. He's just been spectacular for this team, and he's been such a positive on engagers. He's been such a positive on peelers like the Braum. He's just been everything that this team has wanted him to be, and this Alistar game in game number 5 was probably the most important thing towards Energy's success. He was the best player for Energy in this series, and, some people are going to disagree with it, but that's my personal opinion. Again, I think if you want to give it to Palafox, I understand he was kind of the big damage carry, especially towards the back half. I think FBI was probably the most consistent member of the team, with the exception of that game number 4 throughout the entire series. I think all three of those players played incredibly well, and they're all a big reason why Energy is going to be moving on in the series, but for me, Ignar is the one who I want to give the most of the spotlight to. Of course, Dokla and Contracts were fine. I think Contracts definitely struggled, especially in their losses, but in their wins, he was much better, and then Dokla, again, someone who struggled, I think, a bit in their losses, wasn't necessarily a dominant performer in their wins, but the two Rumble games, I think, definitely stand out, games 1 and 5 for Dokla, so Energy moving on. Congratulations to these players. We're going to talk about that final series in just a little bit, but for Team Liquid, that's going to be the end of their LCS journey, of not only their summer split, but of their, domestic play in North America. It's just international left for this org. I think, obviously, they're going to be really excited and really happy to be moving on internationally. But honestly, I am a little bit concerned because there were some pretty major misplays in this game. I like this draft a little bit more. You give some agency to Pioshik on the Rel to be able to move around and try to play for the early game a bit more, which I like. Summit on Gnar, which we'll talk about, usually is a good thing, was not a good thing here. APA off the Nico, off the playmaking potential on something that can be ideally a little bit more consistent, but the Xerath was kind of useless, and Yon and Core on something that can scale into the late game. I like this idea for a draft a little bit more, but they just executed on it so poorly that it ended up not being a positive for this team. Dud of the game was super easy for this one. It's going to go to Summit in the top lane on the Gnar. Easily his worst game of the series. I mean, those flanks towards the back half of the game were absolutely disastrous. Not only for this team, but for him individually as a player. This felt like the worst version of Summit that we had kind of gotten used to in the playoffs throughout his career up until this point. He gets kind of this reputation for being a big game underperformer, and I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that. He's been really good in the playoffs up until this point, but this was a pretty bad game number 5, and certainly one to continue to look at. I think APA obviously struggled a lot in this series. I don't think the Nico was particularly good with the exception of that game 4, but the Xerath certainly didn't work in game 5 here. Yon's positioning was miserable in Game 5, easily his worst game of the series on this Zeri. A pretty poor time for that to end up coming in. Core was really bad in their losses. Pioshik, I think, was probably the best performing member of Team Liquid in this series, but only so much you can do on the Rel to be able to create a lot of action when the rest of the team really isn't performing up to standard. There were a lot of things that I think Liquid needed to fix in this game, and unfortunately, they just didn't really show up in game number 5, but they did push Energy to game number 5, which I think is a good sign. They're going to be moving on to Worlds. This is a team that if they can develop some confidence, if they can develop some momentum, like they could make a splash at Worlds. They could, win a couple of games here or there. I'm not exactly expecting the world of the number 3 seed from North America, but Liquid is a solid team, if not a completely unbeatable one, right? And then Energy, I think, is just better, right? Like they have overperformed every expectation I have given them over the course of this year. I expected them to be pretty early outs in the playoff run. That has absolutely not been the case for Energy. They have been really, really good, and now they are in the LCS finals. It's exciting. It's an exciting time for this org. It's an exciting time for these players, but are they going to be able to get the job done? Well, it's time to go over the LCS finals and find out. But now with the semifinals out of the way, there is only one series remaining here in North America domestically in 2023, and that is your Summer Split Finals. Very excited to go over this. One of these teams I think we all expected to be here. The other, I think, is definitely a surprise, and I'm really excited to see if the upset can be done. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 1 seeded Cloud9 and the number 5 seeded NRG. We just saw NRG be able to take down Team Liquid in a very close series, a very fun series, kind of back and forth, but NRG definitely coming out of that looking like the better team and proving that they deserve to be here in the finals. But Cloud9 is a monster. They are a machine. They have been unstoppable at the North American level for quite a long time now, and really they are on pace to be, arguably one of the best teams of all time. Not only this split, but this year in general. This collection of players, Fudge, Blabber, Eminence, Berserker, and Sven, are one of the best North American teams that we've had domestically in a very long time, and I think a lot of people are going to be considering them major favorites moving into this series, and I personally have to agree. I would be very surprised to see NRG be able to keep up with them in the same way that I think other teams might have been able to at this spot. Of course, we've seen what NRG can do. Players like Contracts, I think, have done a really good job of being able to establish pressure. He had a little bit of a down series against Team Liquid in the semifinals, but I imagine he'd be able to bounce back. FBI and Ignar are playing well. Palafox is playing great. Dokla is a rock on the top side. There are a lot of good things to say about NRG, and them making the finals was a really big accomplishment, but Cloud9 is an uphill battle for sure. They have the best duo in LCS history, in my mind, with Blabber and Berserker. I think really just prime Bjergsen and Doublelift can probably go head-to-head, maybe Doublelift and Core JJ, depending on how you want to view that. But in my opinion, Blabber and Berserker absolutely has a case for being the best duo in North American League of Legends history, and they're a really tough team to beat. Fudge, Eminence, and Sven are your quote-unquote secondary pieces, and those guys are some of the best players in their roles in the entire region, and so not a lot of avenues for teams to be able to outskill Cloud9. Now, one thing Cloud9 has struggled with over the course of this year is actively taking advantage of plays. Oftentimes, you're going to see Cloud9 overextend and put themselves in bad positions, but they're able to get away with it because they are just kind of better than everybody that they're playing against. NRG is one of those teams, mechanically speaking, that can actually go toe-to-toe with them and maybe punish those mistakes a little bit more, so that's something to look out for. But Cloud9 are favorites in this series, and they definitely should be. Is our kind of trend of uncompetitive LCS finals going to continue? Well, or is NRG going to pull off a pretty major upset? We're going to see right now, at the very least, starting with game number 1, because the winner of game number 1 was Cloud9. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and they're going to put themselves in a really good spot. Now, this game really did feel like kind of what we were all expecting this series to be, which was a Cloud9 kind of dominated game where they just kind of outskilled what NRG was doing on the other side. There were a couple of moments coming in from this NRG team that I think were positive, a couple of players that I do want to point out in a positive light, but at the end of the day, basically every 50-50 play, every team fight, every objective, every objective setup, every objective everything, it was going in favor of Cloud9 because they are just better. One for one, they're going to be able to execute a little bit better. At least that's what they were able to do in this first game. And again, it's not particularly surprising. It's a lot of positives to go their way and a lot of players that I think played well. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Blabber in the jungle on this Sejuani. This was a little bit up and down for me. I considered Blabber. I considered Berserker. Those were the two players that I considered for player of the game. I think both kind of fulfilled their roles in different ways, if you will. Blabber, obviously, the setup. Berserker taking advantage and capitalizing on that setup to create the rest of the plays to finish everything off. But Blabber setting everything up was fantastic, and obviously pushing it over the edge for me is him hitting the all-time record for win rate at 300 games, 69%. Nice, really funny stuff, but congratulations to Blabber. I've been saying it for a while. He's arguably the best domestic North American talent we've ever had, like the best North American player, and I really do think that that is absolutely on the table. It's him and Doublelift that I think have that argument against each other, but I don't know how much longer we're going to have to kind of push it back before we just say that Blabber is the best, like, American League of Legends player of all time. I think that that is absolutely in the conversation in this game. This stat, everything that he's been able to do just kind of proves that point again. Another really good game here in the finals in game number 1. I think without their setups, they would have struggled a lot more. Sejuani's one of those champions that can really do a lot more than you expect in the early game. Not necessarily a champion that gets a lot of, attention for how good she is early on in games, but Rel, on the other side of this map, really relies on early pressure and early ganks to be able to snowball the game and get her laners ahead. Sejuani's going to be a little bit more, forgiving, I guess you could say, of a more passive play style in the early game, and I think that Blabber obviously didn't have that. He still was very good in the early game. He did a really good job of making sure bot lane was in a good spot. Fudge did a good job on the top side of making sure he was in a good position, even if Dokla did get a lot of early and mid-game pressure. But Cloud9, I think, in general, just played well, and Blabber was a big part of that. Like I said, Berserker was the other player that I considered here for player of the game. A really nice Kai'Sa game, a really strong champion that you probably shouldn't be giving over to the best player in the LCS. That feels like a pretty massive mistake, but Berserker definitely made them pay for it in this game. The amount of damage that Kai'Sa can do so quickly is absolutely ridiculous. It's not even just the AP variation. It's everything that she does. It's her entire kit, and so Berserker playing great, Eminus, Sven, Fudge, everybody was solid. Sven made a couple of mistakes on the Nautilus, I'll be entirely honest. He was probably the one player that I would say probably needs to clean it up a little bit from what the Game 1 performance was, but it certainly wasn't enough to make this team, lose or to put them in a worse spot. So overall, really nice game number 1 from Cloud9. And then for Energy on the other side, some good and some bad. I actually think a couple of their players played well. Dokla had a good early game, even if he really struggled in the late game. Some of those Rumble ultimates towards the back half, if they were positioned just slightly better with how strong that Rumble was, I actually think could have been a pretty big difference maker, an equalizer, if you will, pun intended, of course, but Palafox is really the other player that you're going to look at here having a pretty solid game number 1. I will admit, I am somehow at the point where I think I'm a little bit lower on Palafox than maybe the general consensus. I've been higher on Palafox basically my whole YouTube career, I guess, if you will. I put him in my all-pro selections, I think in all 3 of the last 3 splits, except this one. Obviously, I did in spring. I did last year in summer as well. When people weren't even really considering him for it, I always thought he was being incredibly underrated by the community for what he was able to output and his consistency, but I think that consistency did take a little bit of a nosedive this year. I still think he has mostly good performances in him, but I'm not necessarily willing to call him a top 1 or 2 mid, like I think a lot of people on Reddit are at the moment. I am willing to accept, though, that he was definitely the best part of Energy in game number 1 here on the Lucian. Don't like this pick all that much, but if you are going to play it, the mid lane is probably the better spot for it at the current moment. Gives you more opportunities to play up and aggressive in lane, especially into something like the Jace. It just allows you to be a little bit more aggro, which is what you want to do with Lucian in the early and the mid game if you get him moving around the map. If you have Rel perma ganking his lane and can get him pretty far ahead, then all of a sudden the mid game is actually really difficult to deal with from the side of Cloud9 because you're indexing so hard into that Kai'Sa. And so I get the idea of it, but the rest of the team really didn't step up. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Contracts in the jungle. Not a particularly good Rel performance. Him getting out jungled in the early game, I think, really set him back a ton. He's going to have to be a lot more clinical towards the back half of the series if Energy wants a shot to be able to keep up. Blabber's a really good player. Contracts has to be able to match in terms of skill, or else this is not going to be a particularly close series. And then FBI and Ignar, I think, really did struggle here in game number 1. FBI in particular, I think his positioning was way too scared, way too safe, and this is something we've seen from him in big moments in the past. He's not really one to make major mistakes, but he is one to kind of take his foot off the gas, if you will, when he's not exactly sure that a play is going to go entirely well. And we saw that, especially around objectives. He was just playing way too far back. You need to play on the edge of danger if you're going to be piloting Zeri in a game like this, and it just didn't feel like he was doing that at a very good level. And then that's basically it, right? Ignar wasn't very good. Dokla had moments. Palafox had moments. But at the end of the day, Energy kind of looked outclassed in game number 1. And that's going to be something that they have to fix. They're going to need to be able to go toe-to-toe with Cloud9 in terms of mechanics and macro and, all of the game mechanics. They can't be outclassed like they were in game number 1. But they do have a chance to be able to bring this series back to even in game number 2. It's certainly not over. But Cloud9 going to look to take a dominant lead in this series by taking a 2-0 series lead. Are they going to be able to do it, or is Energy going to be able to bounce back? Well, the winner of game number 2 was NRG. They are going to be able to take game number 2. They're going to be able to tie this series up at 1 apiece, and this is a nice bounce back after that game number 1, which I did think was pretty rough for this team. To see them be able to come back in game number 2 and actually look, pretty good in this certain circumstance, I think is really, really nice to see. A couple of their players really stepping up. Some of the players that I think you really wanted to see, basically everybody on the team playing well here in game number 2, which is what you want to see, and some pretty uncharacteristically massive mistakes coming in from Cloud9. Not even necessarily from a macro perspective, because obviously Cloud9's been well documented as having some games where they just make bad decisions and win anyways because they can make the most of their bad decisions better than other teams can, make the most of their good decisions. But Cloud9 was just like mechanically misplaying all over the place. A couple of players in particular, I think, had pretty miserable games that I'll go ahead and get into when we get into the Cloud9 section of this, but Let's go ahead and start things off by talking about energy and my player of the game, Palafox. A fantastic game. He's easily been the best player on this team through the first 2 games of this series. A phenomenal NA Jace game. Now, that's what I want to see in the North American Finals. The North American mid laner, Palafox, dominating on Jace, just completely taking over. Now, we've seen Jace kind of fall down in terms of the priority bracket. It's still been really strong, specifically here in North America. But, you know, over in Korea, it's really not been a highly prioritized mid laner, and we have seen teams start to move away from it even here in the LCS as well, and that's certainly something to keep in mind, but it can still be an incredibly strong pick when it gets to do the things that it wants to do, which is take over the early game, be something that is really proactive early, move around the map with the jungle, and just win every fight in the mid game, become this giant artillery mage towards the back half, and make it so difficult for anybody to ever be able to face check you at objectives and just kind of control the map until you can wear them down and end the game. I like this idea, especially when you pair it up with something like Kai'Sa that I think really can kind of further facilitate that. You want to have an Ivern with a Jax, you know, something that can give you a secondary dive-in win condition. I like that idea as well, but when Palafox is playing as well as he did in this game, it doesn't really matter what everybody else on the team is doing. Now, that's not to take away from what Energy was able to do outside of Palafox, just to say that Palafox really was that damn good in game number 2. If he's going to play like this the whole series, Energy might be able to pull off the upset, because this was fantastic. Now, Contracts, I think, also had a really good game on the Ivern, was moving around the map, did a much better job of controlling the early game and setting the tempo, which is majorly important in this matchup. I talked about how Rel really depends and really relies on being able to get that early tempo and early pressure so that she can make a lot of those aggressive plays work, because if you're playing Rel from behind and you're going in only to instantly die, it's not really all that effective, right? When you're playing a champion like Rel, you need to be in at least a relatively advantageous state, something where you can survive. If Contracts is able to outpace her this much in the early game, it's going to be very difficult for Blabber to play the game, and that's exactly what we found here. So good stuff from Contracts. I thought FBI and Ignar were much better here in game number 2. They still weren't necessarily the focal point of the team, but FBI, I thought, did a really good job of being able to capitalize on, Berserker's mistakes, quite frankly, in this game, and Doklo was solid on the top side, even if Fudge really wasn't all that bad either. So, really good stuff from Energy. Basically, everything you wanted to see from them in this game. And then, for Cloud9 on the other side, it's just one game. You're not going to try to overreact, but like I said, a couple of pretty big mechanical misplays that I think are certainly not characteristic of what you would expect from this team. Dud of the game in particular for me is going to go to Eminus on this Annie in the mid lane. Annie's not really a pick that I'm all that high on at the moment. I feel like I'm low on a lot of the picks in the current meta. I feel like there are just some very defined good picks in the meta, and when you go towards the stuff that I don't necessarily feel as confident about, I think it definitely starts to struggle. Although I do like Annie in particular circumstances. The problem is, if you completely whiff your ult stun combo, you're useless as a champion. Like, that is what Annie does, is she ult stuns. And when Eminus misses not 1, but 2 crucial ult stuns throughout this game, not like misclicks, but literally just misses it, like doesn't hit it, that's a major problem. Like, Annie, I don't know how you can mess up the mechanics of Annie, but Eminus was certainly struggling here in game number 2. Palafox had a ton of pressure on him in the early game, pushed him out in the mid game, and then Eminus made some major mistakes towards the back half. He was a big part of the reason why Cloud9 really struggled a ton in this game, which is certainly concerning, but I don't think Blabber had a particularly good game as well. Like I said, lost a lot of pressure early, really wasn't put in a particularly good spot to be able to play out the game from 10 minutes and basically beyond that. And I think when your jungle mid struggles as much as, Cloud9's did in this current meta, like, that's going to be a very hard game to win. Like, even if Berserker and Sven had a good game, which they really didn't, like, Berserker really didn't do all that much in this game. He had opportunities to be able to generate leads on Xayah, just wasn't really able to do it. When you're playing Xayah Rakan into Kai'Sa Alistar, you need to be able to get ahead really quickly in the game, and even without jungle attention, this should have been a win for Cloud9 in the bot lane, and they just really weren't able to do it. Like, they needed to be able to step up. Even if Berserker stepped up, though, I think this game would have been pretty difficult to win because of how strong the Jace was and the fact that you had an Ivern on the other side that was going to actually be able to negate a lot of what the Xayah was going to be doing. Fudge, I think, obviously had some moments on the Renekton where he looked relatively okay. I think he was probably the best performing member on the team here in game number 2, but there's really only so much you can do. This was frustrating for Cloud9. If they're going to play like this, they're going to fall, but can you really expect Cloud9 to play like this an entire series? Probably not. This was a very weird game number 2. Eminus really screwed up and Blabber lost early. I think if one of those things ends up switching, then you're probably in a better spot and you're probably going to be able to win games, but Energy has shown that they are able to beat Cloud9, something that they were not able to do in Winners Finals just last week, and so this is a really big win confidence-wise. Can they kind of continue on that trend? Can they bounce off of this and get a 2-1 series lead to take control, or is Cloud9 going to regain that control here in the third game of the series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was NRG, they are going to be able to take game number 3. They're going to be able to take full control of this series by moving up 2-1, and don't call it an upset, but an upset is on the horizon as NRG really does have full control of this series after the 3rd game. This was a big win for them. They controlled the pacing of this game for the most part. Again, a lot of mistakes coming in from Cloud9, some pretty uncharacteristic ones that I don't think a lot of people necessarily associate with this team, just a lot of mechanical misplays that I think are certainly out of character when we talk about the mistakes and the things that Cloud9 doesn't necessarily do at a ridiculously high level. A lot of that is clean decision-making and not necessarily the way that they handle a lot of these individual matchups, right? They've actually been able to get themselves out of pretty bad situations by being able to outplay them in the past, but honestly, it's the complete opposite in their 2 losses in this series up until this point. It really does feel like they've been in relatively okay positions, but have really just kind of been outplayed in a lot of them, and that's really wild. Really good on NRG to be able to do that, and I do want to throw a lot of the credit their way because I think a lot of this is going to get lost in the fact that Cloud9 isn't particularly playing well, but NRG is playing really well in these games. A couple of players in particular that I'm definitely going to shout out, but worth noting that NRG really has been fantastic. But player of the game for me in game number 3 is going to go to FBI in the bot lane, the 16-1-5 Kai'Sa. Obviously, this is a champion that NRG has used to great effect over the course of the playoffs. Up until this point, we saw what Berserker could do with it in game number 1. We now see what FBI can do with it in game number 3. It's still incredibly strong, but you do have to accelerate it. I really want to give a lot of shout out to FBI and to Ignar because it's not just an auto-win champion. You're not just going to be able to pick it and immediately go on this giant killing spree and dominate the entire game. You do have to be able to pilot it well. Now, I do like the matchup generally into Zeri. I think it does give you a little bit of time to be able to scale up. It's not something that can really punish you all that much in the early game, and so FBI really, had it a lot easier there, and I do think, obviously, the aggressiveness of both Contracts and Palafox in this game definitely helped out a lot. There were a lot of skirmishes, specifically in the mid-game, that ended up getting this Kai'Sa a ridiculous amount of gold, but FBI must have gotten multiple quadra kills this game because it felt like every single fight, he was the one getting the decisive kills and getting the gold, and that's really what accelerated NRG out of this game. I think as soon as we hit like the 30-35 minute mark and FBI had like 10 or 11 kills, there's really only so much Cloud9 can do from that point to be able to contain and stop what NRG was able to do. So really good stuff from FBI. He's been stepping it up a ton over the course of the playoffs, and that continued here. Of course, Ignar was also really good on the rail. This bot lane in general, I think, did a good job, but I would be remiss not to mention both Contracts and especially, again, Palafox in the mid lane, who are having fantastic series. Palafox in particular has really been the driving force for what NRG has done throughout this series up until this point. I know I just talked about in game number 1 how I'm quote-unquote a little bit lower, but that's only because I think he's like the 3rd best mid laner in the league and not the 1st best, but if he's gonna play like this, no, I'm sorry, he's the 1st best. Like, this is a phenomenal finals performance from a player who's never been to this stage before. It's really impressive stuff. The Talia coming out here in game number 3, something that obviously wants to get out on the map, wants to move around, wants to make the mid game a little bit more chaotic for the enemy team, and I think you could definitely say he accomplished his goal in this game. A really, really good game from Palafox to be able to move around the map, to be able to deal a lot of damage. His ultimates were often on point, and for the most part, he set up NRG really well to create a lot of plays throughout this game. Was really good in the late game as well. That Talia can still do a lot of damage in team fights. Certainly don't take that for granted. Contracts continues to be awesome on Sejuani, Sedge, Maokai. These are the things that I think he's really excelled on over the course of this year. Of course, he can play quite a few things. The Rel has been a big pick for him in the playoffs as well, but I think generally speaking, a lot of these hard engaged frontline kind of champions are definitely more up NRG's alley than a lot of other things, and Dokla was good on the top side as well. Certainly the better top laner in this game, playing the Jax into the Aatrox. Just in general, basically everything going right for NRG. Everything that you could have hoped for in Game 3 coming true, and they are now one game away from being your LCS champions in their first split back in the LCS. But Cloud9 certainly don't want to make that easy. Of course, losing this Game 3 was not on their bingo card. I think going down 1-2 in this series was certainly not what they expected, but here we are. They really haven't played well up until this point, if I'm being entirely honest. I do feel pretty bad for Berserker, who I do think tried his absolute best in this game on Zeri to be able to keep it alive. Was dealing a lot of damage, was really good towards the back half in the teamfight stage, as Zeri tends to be, but he didn't really have a lot of help from the rest of the team. Basically, everyone else on this team really underperformed. I don't think Sven, turbo-inted, but I don't think he made a lot of good plays either, and he's kind of been bad across this entire series, even in their Game 1 win, in my opinion. But the top side of the map has kind of been a disaster in the last 2 games, and that continued in this one. Dud of the game is once again going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. It felt like he couldn't hit a single skill shot to save his life, and on Ahri, that's a pretty major problem. If you're not hitting Charm, if you're missing Q, like, that's major. On top of the fact that obviously he was whiffing anti-ults in Game 2, it feels like he is either just crumbling under the pressure, which would be wild considering how well he played in finals last split, or he's just completely mental boomed, which I certainly wouldn't expect considering they didn't lose a game in the playoffs until Game 2 in this series, and so I don't really know what's going on. I don't really know what to tell you, but Eminus is playing about as low as he's played his entire tenure on Cloud9, which is certainly disappointing. Blabber had a really bad game. This kills the 100% win rate on Maokai for Cloud9, which is certainly unfortunate, but Blabber was also pretty terrible in this game, and I really don't know what to make of that. Blabber's really good in finals, or at least he has been over the course of his career. He's someone who has pretty traditionally stepped it up. He's been finals MVP on multiple different occasions. To see him struggle so much against Energy in this series, you do have to give a lot of credit to Contracts and Palafox for that matter, but Blabber is really not playing well. Outside of that game number 1, it is certainly wild. Fudge got destroyed in the top lane. Really not a lot of good things to say in that respect. Just in general, it feels like Cloud9 is not on the same page, and they're certainly not playing well individually, and if they continue to play like this is not going to be a series that they can win. They are now on series point. They are one game away from not winning the LCS, I should say, which felt like a foregone conclusion going into this series, and I certainly think that they at the very least want to bring this to a game number 5, but can they do that? Or is Energy going to pull off the upset in 4 games? Well, we're going to find out right now because the winner of game number 4 was NRG. They are going to do it. They're gonna win Game 4, and not only are they gonna win Game 4, they're going to be your 2023 LCS Summer Split champions. Wow, wild. I did not see this coming. I'm gonna be entirely honest with you guys. This is not anticipated even a little bit. I thought Cloud9, quite frankly, was going to wipe the floor with them. That was my prediction going into this series, was that Cloud9 was going to 3-0 relatively cleanly, but no, actually, it's the reverse. It's a 3-1 win for Energy, not even going to 5 games. It doesn't even take them 5 to take down Cloud9, and they played fantastic in this series. A lot of mistakes coming in from the side of Cloud9 that obviously we are going to talk about, but at the end of the conversation, really what you have to say is NRG as a team outplayed Cloud9 today, and that's why they are your 2023 LCS champions. Wild stuff. Not only did they just win the LCS in their first split back, which is obviously already incredibly wild, but it does mean they're going to be going to Worlds as the number 1 seed from North America. Certainly not expected, but a welcome surprise, I will definitely say. Congratulations to this Energy team. A lot of these players have been at this for years. Only one player on this team going into this series had ever won a championship domestically here in North America or in any major region. That, of course, being FBI with those 100 Thieves titles, but all 4 of the other players are getting their first ever championship, and a lot of them have been working a long time to get here. All of them actually have been working a very long time to end up getting here, but they all played an incredibly major role towards getting here for Energy, for CLG, whatever you want to say. Congratulations to this org. I'm happy for them. Cloud9 obviously going to be incredibly disappointed to not be hoisting this trophy. I think that they were odds-on favorites in a lot of different ways to be able to win, but they weren't able to get the job done. We'll talk about them in a second, but player of the game and player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to FBI in the bot lane. What a game number 4 from him on the Zeri. We obviously talked a lot about the Kai'Sa in game number 3, just really starting to take over in the late game, really being the one to finish off that game and a lot of those fights that really mattered towards the back half, but the entire game in Game 4 was really built and played around this Zeri for FBI. Incredibly impressive performance coming out from him. He was a player that I think a lot of people doubted. I know at least in my comments section, I fought back on a lot of comments that were really putting him down, not only in the middle of this split when he ended up coming over here to Energy, but at the beginning of the year when he went to Evil Geniuses in the first place. There just seems to be this prevailing sentiment that FBI is not a top 3 AD carry in North America, and it's just not something I've ever really agreed with. He's been nothing but incredibly good ever since he broke out for Golden Guardians back in 2020. It's really just been an upward trajectory ever since then. I know a lot of people blame him and Huhi for 100 Thieves kind of collapsing, but clearly that's not the case for either player, as they've both done incredibly well ever since, and I thought he was arguably the best player on Evil Geniuses last split. In fact, I do think he was the best player on Evil Geniuses in spring when that team really disappointed, but them blowing up and Energy, really capitalizing on that. A lot of people said this was going to be a downgrade from Luger. I was one of the few that said FBI is one of the few players that I think can be an upgrade to Luger as much as I like him, and FBI has absolutely come in the clutch. That championship experience, that championship pedigree, he has proven it here on Energy, and he's going to get a very well-deserved Finals MVP from me. I think it was very close to going to Palafox for me, who again had a really good series. I think if his Game 4 was a little bit more consistent on the Nico, I think that I probably would have given it to him, but FBI really took over in this game number 4. And so Palafox ends up taking a kind of a secondary role, a second Finals MVP, if you will, but he still was phenomenal across this whole series. Talk about a mid-gap. Palafaker dominated Eminus in this series. In lane, out of lane, he was so much more useful towards what the team wanted to do, and that was incredibly important. Contracts had a great series, a great Game 4 from him on the rel. He was easily the player that was setting up the most for this Zeri to be able to take over the game. Ignar has been great the entirety of the playoffs. I've talked about that a ton. Dokla, while he has taken more of a secondary role, especially in the playoffs here, I think has still been more than good enough. He's won lane a lot of the time. He's been more useful. Just hasn't necessarily had to carry the games in the same way that maybe some of the players on the team have, So congratulations to all these players. There really are no negatives that I can give them. They've done everything that they're supposed to, and they're now sitting here as your Summer Split champions. And then for Cloud9, certainly going to be at least a little bit disappointing to walk out of this, season without a championship. I think that they were pretty clearly the #1 team in North America basically the entirety of this year without really, variating from that all that much. But and in the end, they just got outplayed. There were a couple of players who I think had a really bad series, chief among them, unfortunately, being Eminus in the mid lane, who's going to get his 3rd straight dud of the game in a row here on Yone. He started out 4-0 on Yone and was like, oh my god, okay, Eminus has shown up. He's going to be able to carry this game. He's going to keep Cloud9 in it. And then he just inted over and over and over again as the game continued to go on. He became more and more useless, less and less useful. I guess I should probably say that's probably a more eloquent way to say it. And it's frustrating. You're allowed to have a bad game. I'm certainly not going to sit here and jump on Eminus as a player, saying that he has no redeeming qualities because he had one bad series. He's had a ton of really good series up until this point this year. And I have seen a lot of comments about how Eminus really wasn't all that good in summer. That's just a lie. Like, it genuinely is just straight up a lie. It's revisionist history, which again, I know LCS fans love to do. They love to see a player play bad over the course of like 1 week and say that all of a sudden now he's been bad for 2 months. That's just not how it works, right? But I do understand it. Eminus was not very good in this series, and so I can understand some of the frustration, but it is what it is. You just have to hope he's going to be able to bounce back when these games go international, but I think a lot of people were really relying, on the rest of this team to be able to kind of capitalize. Blabber obviously wasn't very good in games 2 and 3. It was Berserker's time to not be very good in game number 4. This Draven just never really got off the ground. There really was no aggression in the early game. If you're going to play Draven in his area, you need to be able to capitalize early, and quite frankly, FBI was just straight up better than Berserker in this game. He outplayed him at every single turn, and that's certainly something to keep in mind. Again, I'm not going to sit here and try to overreact. I still think Berserker's the best player in the LCS, and just because he had one bad game, I'm not going to freak out, but it is worth noting that he did have a bad game here in game 4, and it's worth pointing that out. Sven had a pretty poor series in general, in my opinion, just made absolutely no impact and made a couple of big errors. Blabber was really bad in basically every game except game number 4, where he was just kind of bad, and then Fudge kind of got outplayed in the top lane. Really, this was Cloud9 not being on the same level as Energy, and that's certainly not something I expected considering they 3-0'd them last time they played just a week ago, and so a wild series and a wild way for Cloud9 to end their split, but of course, they're still going to be going to Worlds just as the #2 seed instead of the #1 seed, and that's certainly not going to be a bad place for them to be. Maybe their schedule does end up getting a little bit harder, but if they're as good as I think we can, as we hope that they can be internationally, then it shouldn't matter in the long run. For Energy, though, this is a very exciting time. Dokla getting a championship. Contracts finally getting a championship against his former org in Cloud9. Palafox getting a championship. Ignar winning his first ever domestic title. He's never won a domestic title in Europe or in North America, which is wild. Even in Korea, when he played there, a very short amount of time in the LCK. Obviously, he's never won a domestic title. This is his first. And then, of course, FBI, reclaiming his legacy here after things kind of went downhill after the 100 Thieves days. Just generally major positives, and I'm incredibly happy and excited for Energy, for this org, for this team, for these players, for the staff, for everybody. This is well earned, and they absolutely deserve to celebrate it. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS semis and finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for my LCS regional coverage in 2023. We covered every single game in the LCS in 2023 on this channel, and it's been a really fun ride. We know our 3 representatives that are immediately qualifying for Worlds. Of course, Energy winning the LCS, being that #1 seed, Cloud9 as the 2 seed, Team Liquid as the 3 seed. Of course, Golden Guardians will be moving on to the Worlds qualifying series to face Europe's #4 seed for a shot to make it into the play-in stage. But it's been an absolute blast covering North America this year. I've said it once on this channel, I'm going to say it again. Quite frankly, of the 4 major regions, the LCS was my favorite to watch this year, whether it be production value or the games, just the wildness, the craziness. It's not the highest level of play, it's certainly not the cleanest, but in my opinion, this was one of the most fun years of the LCS in a very, very long time, and I think LCS fans definitely recognize that. It was an absolute pleasure to cover all the games, and I really do hope you guys enjoyed it. It couldn't have ended in a better way with Energy hoisting that trophy in their first split. Just wild stuff. This is what dreams are made of. But, you know, of course, if you're new, I'm going to be covering Worlds. So don't go away. If you enjoyed this video, I promise you're going to enjoy my international coverage. It's right around the corner. You know, these North American teams are going to be there. So if you're invested in the league, if you're invested in these players, you're going to want to stick around for that coverage. We're going to be putting a lot of time and effort into all of that. Of course, not only are we covering the LCS, we cover all 4 of the major regions on this channel. So once Worlds does roll around, we're going to have a really good, hopefully fair and unbiased analysis section of just how a lot of these teams end up stacking up, and I'm excited to go over that. Then, of course, if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. And of course, hit subscribe. It really does mean a lot. Hit that bell so you can be notified when all that cool content does end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.